So, Allison Coudert, thanks very much for joining me on Hermitix podcast.
You're
We
very welcome.
we are going to be discussing Giordano Bruno and the Hermetic tradition by Francis Yates for three reasons. So, one is it's a fascinating book, it's a masterpiece, and it's just a brilliant read. And Bruno, of course, is an intriguing figure from history. Secondly, Gallo Glass Books were kind enough to send me a complimentary copy of a new edition of Giordano Bruno and the Hermetic tradition. But thirdly, and arguably most interesting, is that I think I've got my facts right here. Alison, you were the last PhD student of the author of Giordano Bruno and the Hermetic tradition, one Francis Yates. Is that correct?
I think actually she had one other, and that was Marjorie Jones, who ended up writing a biography of her. And not only that, she started a crime series where Miss Yates was the Miss Marple, if
Okay.
you know, like Agatha Christie. I haven't read any. I think there were two books in that series. So I think I made a mistake in that Marjorie was the last.
Okay, but you were
That was
you were a PhD student of Francis Yates, which is pretty fascinating.
yeah. And you have to remember that people were forced to retire in England at 65.
So
So
what age was Yates at that point?
60, well, probably around when I worked with her.
Hmm.
I I got my PhD in 70 and started at the Warburg in 63.
Do you
So
want to introduce yourself and say what what your history is and has led you up to this point, and also what your what your thesis was on under Yates as well?
okay. Well, I had the very good fortune of going to the Warburg Institute as a graduate student. It was kind of fortuitous because I got married in college and my husband worked in London. So I went to London and I was meant to go to University College. And I wanted to work on the history of the Royal Society because I was very interested in the history of science. Um, but they sent me down to the Warburg. And I didn't really know what the Warburg was at that point. I only had the vaguest idea because one of my professors at Vassar had talked about it. So I was kind of excited. And I met Miss Yates, and that was the beginning of an amazing, I guess I was there 9 years, and then I got a senior fellowship and was there for a couple of more years working. And it was a stupendous place. But when I came there, I was a total ignoramus. And Miss Yates started talking about Bruno being a Renaissance magus. Well, I had no idea what a magus was. And then when she went even further and said Francis Bacon, who I had learned was the father of modern science, was also a Renaissance magus, I had to do a lot of reading and rethinking. And I learned so much there. So I went on and I did my PhD on a very interesting character named Franciscus Mercurius von Helmont, or Francis Mercury von Helmont, who spanned the 17th century, born in 1618, died in 1698. And he knew everybody, and he had grown up during the horrors of the 30 Years' War. So he was very concerned with bringing peace, religious peace, to Europe. And he was very interested. He thought he could do it through the Jewish Kabbalah. So he and a friend, Knorr von Rosenroth, collected Lurianic Jewish Kabbalist texts and thought on their basis they could bring together Catholics and Protestants and pagans and Muslims and atheists all in this wonderful religion that would unite everybody. And of course, what happened to him, he got thrown in jail by the Inquisition. But he had friends in high places and escaped. And this is when he became a great friend of the wonderful, wonderful philosopher Leibniz. And so I wrote a book, not only the first book on Francis, no, actually my first book I think was on Leibniz and the Kabbalah, because I found a lot of manuscripts suggesting that Leibniz had been influenced by Kabbalistic ideas of universal salvation and the restoration of the world. So that's sort of my background. And because I worked on things like alchemy, witchcraft, and the Kabbalah, I never was able to get a job when I got back to America because everybody thought I was a kook. But what I really wanted to study is how was alchemy part of the scientific revolution? What role did it play in the genesis of what we now call modern science? How did the witchcrafts, why did they occur during the period of Galileo and Kepler and Newton? And what relation did they have, the witch trials have, to the scientific revolution? And again, the Kabbalah and scientific revolution. Well, eventually I did, thank God, manage to get a job. And so I recently retired from the University of California at Davis, where I had a wonderful 18 years. And before that, I guess another 18 years or so at Arizona State. So life has been very good to me.
And you've jumped between a lot of big genres or big fields. And
Yes.
this is the question where you wanted to start. And I thought it was interesting that you wanted to start with this question because it's a place that many people just take for granted, our distinctions and definitions between things. But you have moved between all of these fields. And so you wanted to outline the distinctions between religion, magic, and science. And I guess,
Yes.
especially with regards to this book, which is, involving all of them, it's pretty key to have put them in their right place.
It's impossible, really, and especially in the early modern period, to distinguish between, make clear boundary markers between religious science and magic. I mean, the notion was control and getting power over nature. And of course, magic was involved with that. And so was science. Remember, science was called natural philosophy back then. And religion, as many wonderful scholars have shown, John L. Brooks, I think, being a major one, that Christianity really, in its own way, was a spur to scientific research. And that came through the notion that there were two books that every Christian should read: the Hebrew Bible and the Gospels, of course, but the book of nature. Okay, so nature was seen as a second book, which would show the glories and wonders of God. And that's why Robert Boyle, who has been called the father of modern chemistry, said that natural philosophers, i.e. scientists, were the true priests, okay, because they investigated the book of nature. So they were really teaching about God. And Boyle endowed a series of lectures on the truths of Christianity. At the same time, he was working as both an alchemist and setting the stages and the foundations for modern chemistry. So they're all in the mix. And this has become more and more recognized by scholars. And that's why the whole discipline of esotericism came into being, really starting around the time of Yates's publication of Bruno. And I only got involved with meeting my fellow esotericists quite late in the game, because I was sort of a solitary creature off in the wilds of Western New York when I got back to America. And it's a field that's growing and keeps emphasizing the fact that it is really difficult to separate, particularly before the mid-19th century, religion, magic, and science. And there are plenty of people with very good arguments to argue to this day that science and spiritual ideas and religious ideas still work together. And one of the great ones is Egil Asprem, Asprem. And he's written wonderful stuff about quantum mechanics, the Heisenberg principle of uncertainty, and how all these have spiritual implications. And a second person who was an undergraduate at Arizona State, no, Davis, just before I came, but who is now teaching at my former alma mater, Vassar, is Christopher White, who's written books about how magical ideas come into modern science and influenced ways that modern scientists have thought. So there's a large field out there which really has added, I think, incredible nuance and dimensions to the history of science and the history and the field of religious studies.
And where exactly does Hermeticism fit within those? That's another tricky subject.
Well, I think that gets us right back to Yates, so that's great. And of course, her thesis was that Bruno was a Hermeticist, that he had read the Florentine Platonists, and he'd read the Asclepius, which is one of the major Hermetic texts. She never, ever argued that Hermeticism was science. All right, so there's a little caveat in her book that she didn't think Bruno was a scientist. All right, now this has been challenged, and I'd love to talk about that a bit, because subsequent historians have said, no, Bruno really was a scientist. Yeah. But Yates felt he was influenced by Hermeticism to have a notion that human beings had the agency and the will to improve the world and to investigate the world. So she's not saying that Hermeticism is directly connected to the development of science.
What would have been the more, I mean, I guess, against, what is that viewpoint against at the time? What would have been the more common viewpoint in terms of improving the world? The belief that we can't?
Well, remember, the doctrine of original sin was really important. And if you look at Augustine, we are so innately fallen as creatures, and it has affected not only our ability, but nature too, as a result of the fall, has gone into, the earth used to be perfectly spherical, and now there are mountains and things. So it took really an onslaught on the doctrine of original sin to give space to this notion that humans had a right and the ability. They were not these horrible fallen creatures, okay? They made a mistake. They didn't sin, and you can correct a mistake. And Bruno was instrumental in this. I think he was executed, and I'm following Hilary Gotti on that. Hilary Gotti argues against Yates that Bruno actually was a scientist who was very influenced by the pre-Socratics, Pythagorean, Epicurus, Lucretius, people like that, and that he was executed because he was a heretic. Mm-hmm. All right, and you have to remember that Bruno accepted the Arian heresy. He did not believe in the Trinity. All right, he believed that God was higher up than his son, Jesus Christ. So he had the Arian heresy. He rejected the worship of saints. He rejected the virgin birth. He thought that the church fathers before Augustine were the ones you should read, and not in the first 2 centuries, not later. And most important of all, he objected to the doctrine of original sin and the idea that man was fallen. And he hated the whole story of the fall and the notion that God would prohibit man from eating from the tree of knowledge. In this sense, he was quite like some of the Gnostics. Why would a good God not want his creatures to have knowledge? That becomes a sort of leitmotif in a lot of thinkers, and then ends up in the Enlightenment thinkers with basically a denial that we have original sin and a denial of a basic Christian idea that curiosity is a bad thing. In a lot of Christian thought, and particularly Augustine, curiosity is a negative thing. You shouldn't fly too high. I think it's Romans chapter 11, verse 20, that Bruno and other people said was mistranslated. Okay, Jerome mistranslated. It was supposedly don't be high-minded, which I think means don't be haughty or something. And Jerome translated it to don't think about high things. All right. We all think of the story of Daedalus and Icarus. And Icarus flew too high and had to, his wings were melted. And that was just such a theme in Christian thought. Don't fly too high. Don't try to know these things that you shouldn't know. In a way, Bruno, we might say, was a Kantian, separating the noumenal from the phenomenal. And he wanted to study the phenomenal, and he wanted absolute freedom to do that without limits. And that's why Hilary Gatti says he was executed. And that goes back to Dorothy.
For Gotti, it's because she reads him more as a scientist, as a
Yes.
curious. So there's sort of three paths there of he's executed because he's a sort of traditional heretic, if you want to put it that way. He's executed because he's a hermeticist, as per Yates, and then theory of Gotti's theory that he's a scientist. And you lean more towards that Gotti's theory?
I think there's a combination of all these things. Hermeticism does come into science. You've got to remember Hermes Trismegistus, the great figure on the floor of the cathedral in Siena, the thrice great Hermes, was supposedly the founder of alchemy as well as Hermeticism. And I would argue, following Bruce Moran and a million other people, that alchemy was a terror, and Newman and other people, but Principe, Lawrence Principe, wonderful historians of science, that alchemy was a major force in promoting and laying the foundations for modern chemistry. And that really alchemy and chemistry only kind of really split in the 18th century, So as a result of Yates's work, I think what Yates did is what every great historian or thinker does: rile up people and get them thinking about stuff. I mean, this idea that she could have been wrong and that's terrible is so silly. I mean, it's consistency. What did Emerson say? Consistency is a hobgoblin of small minds. I mean, she was mistaken, I think, on a lot of things, but she threw ideas out. And so she encouraged many people to come back and say, well, who and what was Bruno and what was he doing? But not just that, what actually were the factors that produced modern science? And why did modern science, as we know it, basically develop in the West? Now, I'm not denying Islamic influences, Chinese influence, Egyptian influence. It's just that I think all those influences were very important on European science. But what we know as science emerges, I would argue, in the West in the 18th, 19th century. But these are huge issues, and I don't pretend to know anything.
Well,
everything.
As we're sort of getting closer and closer to the book and Yates's central thesis, I do want to ask, as it's one of the few times I'll get to ask this, what was Yates like to sort of to study under and with? Which she seems, I get the impression she was quite imposing figure?
Oh, she was really fascinating and so curious about everything. In a way, she was a terrible tutor because she was interested in everything, and I remember she went to Princeton to give some lectures. And I don't think she'd ever been to Princeton before. And when she came back, I think I write about this in the introduction to the book on Glenn Helmont, but um, she came back absolutely mesmerized by the parking lots in Princeton because of the way sunlight beamed off the top of car roofs. I mean, she just noticed all these things. I think she had an uncanny ability to get into the minds of people like Lowell and Bruno in a way I can't possibly. And even if she maybe was wrong, I mean, it's very hard for modern people to really get in the mindsets of people that were born so long ago. But she was just an amazing person. You have to think that she made her own way as a woman scholar. She was born in 1899, I believe, and she died in 1980. But she never had a formal education as a young person. She was tutored by one of her older sisters, who later became a missionary in Africa, I think, and did the diagrams in her Bruno book. Um, uh, she always lived with her parents. I mean, she didn't marry, so she lived at home, but she got herself a external degree at London University, I think in French. I've forgotten a little bit. And she did that. She commuted up and down. But there really it wasn't a coterie of women scholars the way there is now, to kind of help her. And she sort of got into the Warburg, which came in 1938 in the diplomatic pouch, 4,000 books in the diplomatic pouch. I don't know what that means, but the library was allowed to leave Hamburg because of the Nazis and be set up in London. And so she got involved with that and really helped all the German emigres who came to London, Jewish scholars who came to London and came to the Warburg Institute, one of them being Sir Ernst Gombrich. He wasn't Sir Ernst when he started out. And as I remember, Yates was instrumental in helping him learn English. And he wrote stunning English. And in fact, he refused to speak German until very late in his life when the Hamburg Warburg Institute was reconstituted. They wouldn't speak German for years and years and years. So Yates she wasn't impressive in the scary way at all. She was just impressive because she was interested in so many things and very kind and very thoughtful and very helpful. And she looked a little bit like Agatha Christie's Miss Marple in the early films. So she was just great. And I used to go to tutorials at 5:00 on Mondays with her. And sometimes I'd walk in the room and the lights were off. And she'd actually be sitting at her desk contemplating, That's something that happened at the Warburg. I think I told James when we talked last week that one of the most astonishing things for me was to have tea at the Warburg and be sitting with Francis Yates, Professor Gombrich, Daniel Perkin Walker, all these extraordinary scholars. And there were actually pauses in the conversation because they thought before they spoke, something no Americans do. So it was a wonderful really a wonderful period for me, and stressful because I was with such extraordinarily well-educated people with total classical backgrounds. And I just don't know how people knew so much, and I didn't know that much.
And this sort of curiosity of Yates comes through in her style as well. Because if you
Yes.
pick up Giordano Bruno in the Hermetic tradition, you're not going to be reading anything that feels or reads close to a contemporary academic text. It's very accessible, it's very fun, and it just comes across that she just wants you to really, here are the ideas, you play around with them. Here's what I think, you play around with it.
I love that you see that. I mean, I think she even uses exclamation points, which is completely verboten now, in scholarly writing. She was an enthusiast. I mean, I think she studied these people and wanted people to recognize them. Yeah, so that's a very good point you make.
Mm-hmm.
So reading her is fun. Now, I think the Bruno book is pretty hard, and I'm not sure I'd suggest that as a beginning one. But she wrote a book on the Valois tapestries that is just great, doing a sort of iconographic interpretation of what they meant and why they were, made in the first place and what they symbolized and signified. And then she wrote, I think one of my favorites is the French academies of the 16th century, where she talks about these wonderful academies that existed that probably seem so odd to my favorite is Baif's Academy. Baif was a musician, and he had all these musicians around him, and they were trying to recover two lost modes. Apparently, there were 4 modes in Greek music, and 2 of them were sort of lost. If you read Plato, he has 2 modes. He likes the warlike modes, but the soft ones or something he didn't like. And so Baif and these scholars were trying to rediscover these modes because they actually thought, and remember, this is during the terrible religious wars of the 16th century in France. He actually thought that if they could sing the Psalms in Greek with these modes, that he could bring peace. All right, so this gets us into the whole area of the power of music, the power of sound, of the power of words, that we don't really respect anymore. I mean, I think we realize that if a king says off with your head, you get shorter pretty fast. But what they basically believed is that sounds, images, symbols had tremendous power in shaping not only your own mind, but the whole atmosphere around you. Sound was a potent force. It went out of you. It's kind of like sight. They believed that the eye actually had beams that came out, so that an individual could influence other people and their surroundings through these means, which is not so different from the work of people today who are interested in, different kinds of experiences and auras. And
well, it's this bridge that I want to turn to, because alongside the Bruno heresy, which is sort of almost like the famous thesis happening in the book, the undercurrent is really one of the bridge between medieval magic and science. This is something you sort of emphasized to me, and I think this is sort of these 2 points that have so many similarities, with Hermeticism acting as a bridge. So I wonder if you can expand on this, and where does Yates begin witnessing this bridge between what we used to distinguish as magic and then now modern science, trying to separate them safely. But this seems to be the broader undercurrent of the text.
Good point. I think her interest in Cosimo de' Medici's Platonic Academy in Florence. Okay, Cosimo set up this academy, and in his wonderful palace that is still there, and you can go see it. And he had the wunderkind of the 15th century. I guess he was, can't remember his dates, but Pico della Mirandola, who is this 21-year-old genius, who wrote these I don't know how many theses.
700 or 900, I think.
No, that's Luther, 95 theses.
Oh, no, 700, or it's in the hundreds.
700.
I think it's 700, yeah.
And he sent them to the Pope because he believed, he'd studied Arabic philosophy, he had studied the Hermetica, he had read the Asclepius, all these Hermetic texts. And so he put everything together because he too wanted peace. And he sent off these 700 theses or conclusions or whatever to the Pope. Guess what? The Pope did not accept them. Okay. But he was there reading these texts. And then there was Marsilio Ficino, who really was a kind of Gnostic magus, that in particularly in Yates's view, but I think there's a lot of truth in it, that he also believed that human beings had agency and they could do miraculous things if they put their mind to it. So I think those ideas sort of got Yates thinking about all this. And then she comes across Bruno and sees a connection between Bruno and the Florentine Platonists, who read the Hermetica. So she put all these things together and really made a case for magic being part of modern science. And again, I just stress that Hermes Trismegistus, the so-called author of the Hermetic text, was the founder of alchemy. And so medieval alchemy comes in here too. So there is more of a connection between these kind of magical, philosophical kinds of views and modern science has been gradually uncovered. When I was at Vassar, we still read the 3-volume History of Science of George Sarton, published in 1930. I'm not that old, guys. I'm pretty old, but, I graduated in 1963. But we still read that book. And Sarton's point was good science only emerged when bad religion and bad magic disappeared. So I would suggest to you this whole new kind of interest in esotericism and the resurrection of magic and and what you are working on, esoteric forms of Christianity that are Aryan, that reject the worship of saints, and all these things that Bruno did were terribly important in laying the foundation for this idea that man can do what he wills. He can improve the world and himself.
So I guess in Yates's view, what is what we call modern science missing? Because it seems that magic or especially the symbolic elements of Hermeticism seem to, allow for a deeper appreciation, like you were mentioning earlier with the Book of Nature, this actual, arguably a hermetic study, something hidden, an esoteric study. What is modern science in that, I guess, the secular sense? What's that kind of missing?
Well, there is where I think you go to someone like Egil Asprem, who, shows us that modern science is incredibly magical in many ways. Because we have the uncertainty principle, we have quantum mechanics, we don't understand it. We have string theory, we have all these incredible notions of different dimensions. These kinds of different theories played into new forms of spirituality that developed in the 20th century, particularly among artists and painters. And these are the people that Christopher White deals with in his books, Other Worlds. So he's showing how scientific ideas actually promoted religious, spiritual thinking. So they're both coming in all kinds of directions. So I think to argue that modern science is, so rational,
Hmm.
I mean, it obviously is rational to a certain point because you have people agreeing and trying to redo experiments. Um, but there's a lot of things there that are immensely interesting in terms of, I think, for people's spirituality and religiosity. And you have to remember, I mean, Kekulé, who's known for discovering I don't know what you call it, but the form of the benzene ring.
Yeah, the Ouroboros.
He did that because he had a dream of the Ouroboros. So, I was lucky enough to get to the Institute of Advanced Study at Princeton, and I gave a lecture on the Kabbalah and Francis Mercury von Helmont and his connection with Leibniz. And one of the people in the audience who was at the Institute, I think is a sociologist, I can't quite remember, but he just got so agitated. I mean, he said, that can't be. Modern scientists do not deal with this kind of thinking. This is just awful. And I don't know how you respond to that. I don't think I did it very successfully, except to say, well, I think I have evidence here that, for instance, Leibniz's notion, I mean, the idea that Voltaire had this idea that Leibniz thought this present world was the best of all possible worlds. I think that by the end of his life, he discarded that idea completely, and he felt that this was the best of all possible worlds because it had the power to become the best of all possible worlds. Mm-hmm. And he was influenced very much by the Kabbalist doctrine of tikkun, that man and God had to work together. They had to collaborate. It's almost like process theology. They had to collaborate in bringing the world back to its original perfection. And he writes about this. And in my book on Leibniz and the Kabbalah, I quote him. I'm not sure I've convinced too many Leibnizian scholars yet, but maybe.
Well, it seems there in that interaction that the Enlightenment values are really what we still, even unconsciously, we hold to so dearly, that the reason is the only path to ever get anywhere, any knowledge, any truth is only reason. So I want to, I guess, put it to you in light of this conversation. What are the other paths?
Okay, but you've made such a good point, because one of the definitions of being modern is you're not magical. Mm-hmm. So that's a total Enlightenment view. But that view didn't last very long, even in the 18th century, because at the end of the second half of the 18th century, you get this growth in sensibility and this notion that emotions are equally important in human cognition. Hume makes this argument, right? A lot of people do. And then you go into the 19th century and you get the Romantics. And the Romantics, a lot of them go back to Hermeticism and things like this. They go back to these earlier doctrines, and they think that the imagination and the emotions are the sources of our great intuitions. And so you have some artists and all kinds of, surrealism, and God knows all the wonderful melange of artistic thought that develops. That really disproves this idea that reason is the be-all and end-all. But that continues. You're absolutely right. It continues on, that being rational is the sign of being modern.
Are we making some reverse progress, do you think, back to maybe even sitting at our desks contemplating like Yates did?
But it's really difficult. I mean, one of the things that I'm trying to figure out is this resurgence of fundamentalist religious views that to me are terrifying, that deny science, deny vaccines, deny medical things, that are ruling the Trump administration now and cutting scientific funding. I mean, that's an extreme form of conspirial or conspiratory, I don't know what the word I want here is, religious thinking that to me goes right back to saying that man has no agency whatsoever, that God is in charge of everything. So there's no point in us trying to fix the climate or anything because God, is doing everything. So, magic has come back into the world in some progressive ways, I think, among artists and philosophers and romantics, and then some very pejorative ways that want us to not read books, to not have an education. So we're in such a flux. I don't know what you think about this, James. I'm wrestling with all this.
Well, it seems that it mirrors, in a certain sense, it mirrors Bruno's era of one of the reading the biography by I forgot her name, Ingrid. I forgot her name, but the biography of one of the biographies of Bruno called Philosopher Heretic. One thing she really emphasizes is that during the Inquisition, obviously Bruno is also trained as an inquisitor at some point. So you have this sort of irony that he actually was trained in the methods that they employed on him. And he was so,
wow,
he was so, I don't think he ever became one, but he was in training for it. He's trained as a Jesuit. But because of this, and because of his own knowledge and arguably genius, the Inquisition was longer than most, and they really couldn't get anywhere with him because he was so well studied. And so at the end of the day, his curiosity and his love for knowledge, it didn't really mean anything because they didn't really need a reason at the end. They'd decided, this is too far away from, I guess, the comfort of their own reason, if you want to put it that way.
Yep.
And so, it was really, sounds a bit cheesy, but it was his curiosity that sort of killed him because he wouldn't let up.
Yeah.
So that seems to possibly be the state that we're in, is one of my curiosity is the thing that's and it's a great book to talk about around that because it's a book that is curious for its own sake.
Yeah. But you're right, there's an attack on curiosity today. You don't want your children to read anything, if you're a fundamentalist Christian, that might, this was put in the 2010 Texas Constitution, that you don't want to expose children to anything that might criticize their religious thinking. They're talking about 8, 9, 10-year-old children. Okay. What is their religious thinking? I really do not think that an 8, 9, or 10-year-old has a great idea of original sin and purgatory or whatever, or hell, or it's beaten into them. But I think you're right that we're kind of back in that age. Maybe that's where people just are. The Enlightenment only, affected a small number of people. They happen to be the movers and shakers. And now with media and everything, you have just a much wider variety and kinds of people who can take over and persuade people that their views are the right ones. So it's interesting.
But just to jump back to him as a bit shoehorned in, I do want to sort of emphasize Bruno's position, because Bruno holds a fairly peculiar position in that he's not a traditional Christian and also not moving towards the Enlightenment view. So there's this strange middle ground with him.
I think he is moving towards the Enlightenment when he wants to separate natural philosophy from religion. He doesn't want theology to come in and dictate what one can study. So I think, I think that becomes a premise in the Enlightenment, that let's separate these two things. So, whether he's an Enlightenment thinker or not, I think he has some of the basic ideas that curiosity is a good thing, that people should be allowed to have free thought. Just as Galileo argued.
But he would be studying what you mentioned earlier as the Book of Nature, sort of on its own terms, without the theology.
Yes, I think so.
Okay,
I think so. So all these issues are, still with us today. So Bruno is an amazing, I think, figure to sort of get your teeth around if you possibly can, for all these different ways of thinking that have become, I think, more recognized as a result of these more nuanced historians of science and the religious studies scholars who are seeing, that it's very hard to draw fast and hard boundaries. People are always going to be influenced by their, however you describe it, worldviews, spiritual views. I mean, there's no way of separating those things, I think, from our daily thought. But I don't know what you think about that.
Well, I would ask of that. Do you think that's what we can take from the book as a whole today? Is that it's not trying to give you a comfort? It's a book of just historical idea exploration for its own sake, and that's what we should really take from it today. Is to maybe try return to that form of thinking that is curious for its own sake, but not really. I don't know. Not trying to.
I don't think Ms. Yates, was a preacher at all.
Yeah.
I think she just was an intensely curious scholar who wanted to make these people relevant, in ways and get us thinking about how we think and why we think in certain ways. And how, I wrote an awful lot about the attempt to find a natural language that became such an important thing in the 17th and 18th century because of religious conflict. People wanted to have a language that was so clear that people wouldn't mistake views and start fighting over the Trinity and stuff like that. And that was, Leibniz began his calculus to try to devise a language that you could do mathematics in. You could say 2 times 3, equals this concept. And then you could just express yourself in terms of mathematics. Well, he didn't get too far with that, but he did get the calculus. But that was in the back of his mind, this way to get people basically to be on the same page so they wouldn't fight all the time. We haven't gotten there, obviously.
Is there anything you'd like to add about the book or Yates that you feel is key that we haven't spoken about so far?
I just love your podcast and the idea that you are willing to entertain these ideas and get people to come on and talk about them. I mean, it's been just a major force in my life. I always tell students, be careful who you pick as your graduate advisor, because that person may influence your life in more ways than your parents ever did, or your husband or wife or lover or whatever. Miss Yates certainly set my life on a course that has really been fun and fascinating. So I think the more you do podcasts with all kinds of thinkers, please don't do really ones on people who want censorship and the new apostolic reformation. Don't get any of those people on your podcast, or maybe you should.
I'm not sure.
It's the new apostolic reformation is a force that's in our White House.
Okay.
In the first Trump administration, they were doing biblical studies, and they're still there. And they're terribly conservative, and they believe that all Americans have to be Christian. They're very conservative when it comes to abortion and women's rights and things like that. And they are powerful. It's scary. And maybe you should actually get them on, because then their views would be better known, because they're sort of in the background. I don't know if you ever saw the picture of Paula White, who was the guru for Trump, supposedly. And there's a picture of her with these people from the new apostolic reformation around Trump. And she is putting her hands on his chest because she believes that he's ordained by God to be president. I think that's rather scary.
Well, I'll have to. It's new to me, so I'll have to look into that. But
Well, I'll send you an article I wrote about them, and then maybe you should. Maybe you should interview one of them.
it definitely sounds intriguing. But I do want to ask, where do you think? So earlier you mentioned this a little bit. You said probably not the best place to start with Yates because it's quite a long and somewhat difficult book. So where would you advise? Is the Tapestries book is where you advise to begin with?
I love the Valois tapestries. The only course I took at Vassar on art history, I loved it. It was fantastic. You just looked at beautiful art, but it was done from the point of view of taste and, balance and shapes and stuff. And I never really quite got it. But when I got to the Warburg, and their emphasis was on what's called iconography, what do these figures mean? What do they represent? What do they symbolize? What is Botticelli's Venus on a clamshell? What is that doing? What does it refer to? What's the mythology behind it? What kind of mood was it meant to bring? And what was it meant to do? And this is part of this whole idea that images are very powerful. And so that was just such a treat for me, because I felt I had a way into art that I didn't with just the sort of connoisseur kind of approach to art. So I love the Valois tapestries. I love the French academies. Now, these are going to be hard to get, but maybe they're online, by now. I also love The Art of Memory.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a terrific book. And just some of her essays. But Bruno's hard, but people should try it. It's come out. And, you don't have to understand everything when you read book, but then you get to know a little more about Francis Yates. And I think that's a good thing.
And whereabouts can we find your work? Because you've also written a lot of books.
On Academia, I put a lot online.
Yeah.
On Academia, so you can find a lot of articles. And I put on the Leibniz and the Kabbalah, and I put on the Francis Mercury von Helmont, the impact of the Kabbalah in the 17th century, and some other books, and lots of articles. So yeah. And the one about the new apostolic Reformation is an article I wrote on toxic positivity about Donald Trump and his connection with the whole movement for positive thinking that came out of Norman Vincent Peale's book about the power of positive thinking that came out in 1950. And Peale had this church in New York. I think it was called the Marble. I can't quite remember the name of the church, but Trump's father went there and took Trump there, and Trump got to know the pastor extremely well. And he was very influenced by positive thinking. And that's why he never does comparatives. If you listen to his speeches, it's always the best, the brightest, the biggest, the this. He's used to this kind of positive thinking. Now, not denigrating positive thinking, but there is a very dark side to it when you start arguing that you can cure yourself from cancer by positive thinking, and that people are poor because they are lazy and they don't think positively. So that's where the connection comes in to things like the new apostolic Reformation, which really is very down on any kind of, it's your relationship with God that's all important. Social factors, if you grow up in a ghetto, if your parents are drug addicts, if you don't have a decent school, none of those things matter. The only thing that matters is that you have a straight relationship with God, which means that you give up welfare programs. You don't, so that's where I wrote that.
Okay. Well, I should put the links for Galaglass's book in the description below, and for your own website for links to all these papers and your own work. But it seems like a good place to finish up. So Allison Coudert, thanks very much.
Okay. I'll send you a list of Yates books to put up too.
Thank you.
Okay. Thanks, James.